Would you pray with me? Creator God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. Well, this is Memorial Day weekend, and on this day we give special remembrance to those who made the ultimate sacrifice, defending our country against those who would do us harm. We as a free society are forever indebted to the men and women and others who fought for and died for the people of this country. We live the way we choose because they chose to live the way they did. All gave some, this is true, but some gave all. Today we remember those who gave all. Can we have a moment of silence to remember those who gave their lives in service for the people of this country? Amen. Their sacrifice is an example for us all. But they are not alone in their sacrifice. Throughout history, many men and women and others have sacrificed their lives for great causes. From the ideal of freedom to the wisdom of Jesus, many have risked their lives or even laid down their lives for what they felt was right, or what they felt God was calling them to do. One such person was the great Harriet Tubman. Harriet was born into slavery in 1820 on a plantation in Maryland. One day when she was 6 years old, after working in the fields all day, her owner's wife commanded her to care for a sick child through the night. The child cried when Harriet fell asleep, and as a result, Harriet received a beating that resulted in scars she would bear for the rest of her life. By the time Harriet was 11, she was working in the fields with the men. On one occasion, she received a head injury that almost caused her death. For days, she was in bed near death. After she recovered, she suffered from headaches and seizures, and she began to receive visions, which she believed were from God. Neither Harriet nor her parents could read or write, but her parents knew Bible stories that had been told to them. They shared these with Harriet as she grew up, and they taught Harriet to know God. When Harriet told her father she yearned for freedom, he told her to pray to God and to trust God. She prayed that her harsh master might become a Christian. But when that did not happen, she prayed that God would take him out of the way. The master soon died. This terrified Harriet, and she prayed to God for forgiveness, blaming herself for his death. Harriet lived in constant fear of white people and constantly feared being sold to another plantation and losing her family. She continued to pray for her freedom, even though her friends told her it was foolish. In 1849, Harriet's owners, it's hard for me to even say that, but Harriet's owners were planning to sell her to another plantation in the Deep South, separating her from her family. But a Quaker woman intervened and helped Harriet and two of her brothers escape. Harriet traveled through the Underground Railroad system to freedom. By night, she traveled using the North Star as her guide, and during the day, she hid in swamps or buried herself in the ground. Slave catchers with bloodhounds were in constant pursuit, but Harriet vowed she would never be taken alive. At last she reached Pennsylvania, a free state. She got a job and saved up money, but she missed her family that she left behind. After some time, she heard word that her niece and young children were going to be sold. So dedicating herself to the same freedom she enjoyed to those she loved, she boldly went back south to guide her family to freedom. She rescued her niece and her niece's children, and they all began a prosperous life in the free state of Pennsylvania. Later that year, Harriet rescued her 3 brothers and others, and the next year she rescued her parents from slavery. Harriet became a conductor, so they say, on the Underground Railroad. She was brave and she was bold, and she was very firm in her convictions. Once a person agreed to go with Harriet on the journey to freedom, there was no turning back. If a slave gave in to fear and tried to turn around out of cowardice, Harriet would actually pull a revolver out and tell the frightened person, "You go on or you die." Firm language, I know. But once they tasted freedom, a person did not question her methods. Harriet boasted after 8 years of helping slaves get to freedom that she never lost a passenger. The slaves loved her and called her Moses. John Brown consulted with Harriet as he planned the raid on Harper's Ferry. Slaveholders feared Harriet and offered a bounty on her head. In her 8 years as a conductor, she rescued more than 300 men and women who had been enslaved. And then came the Civil War. During the Civil War, Harriet served as a spy for the North, gathering intelligence about the Southern battle plans and troop activity. In 1863, she led the Union Army in an armed assault that liberated more than 700 slaves. Harriet was never paid by the Union Army for her efforts. After the war, she set out establishing homes for orphans, for the elderly, and for the homeless. She died in 1913. Harriet devoted her life to her faith, and that devotion led to all of those people receiving their freedom, contributing to the success of the Union Army and its victory over the tyranny and racism of the Confederacy, and hundreds more receiving care and nurture after the war. Harriet's actions as a devoted servant of God are an example to us all. Now, while much has been written about Harriet Tubman and her status as a true American hero, not as much is known about Tabitha, the devoted servant we are examining today in our lesson from Acts. What Jim read today is the extent of what we know about Tabitha, a testimony to her devoted service. Yet Tabitha, through the Greek translation of her name Dorcas, is legendary in church circles as a devoted servant of God. Women's service circles in the German evangelical tradition have named themselves after Dorcas, testifying to her devotion and dedicating themselves to lives of service in honor of her. The lines of type in the Bible with her name are few, but her legacy far exceeds that obscurity. So Tabitha is the disciple of study for today. Each Sunday since the first Sunday of Easter, we have taken a different post-resurrection apostle and examined their life, from Thomas and Paul to Lydia, and last Sunday we talked about Peter and Cornelius. This week it's Tabitha. Like Paul, Tabitha had two names. Living in a pluralistic world, this was common. Tabitha was her Hebrew name, Dorcas was her Greek name. She would have answered to either one, depending on who was calling. In either translation, her name means gazelle. In fact, there is even a species of gazelle known as the Dorcas gazelle, which is indigenous to Israel. In Acts this morning, when we met Tabitha, she was dead. At this point, her work as a dedicated servant was already legendary. Like Harriet Tubman, she dedicated her life to helping others. In her case, it was widows who had nothing after their husbands had died. The book of Acts tells us that she dedicated her life to good works and acts of charity. The book of Acts also calls her a disciple. So she must have known of Jesus and his wisdom teachings. From this, we can safely assume that she took Jesus' message of love and peace and humble devotion to servanthood, to her heart, and exemplified them in her life. Embodying the wisdom of Jesus, she dedicated her life to serving others, even at the risk of her own, and that service became legendary. Peter was not far away when Tabitha died. The devoted servants who cared for Tabitha at the time of her death sent for Peter. I'm sure that when they sent for him, they had no idea what he was going to do. They were not expecting the miracle that was to come. They didn't have Tabitha's resurrection on their minds when they sent for Peter. They were simply consumed with mourning. They washed and prepared Tabitha's body according to the Jewish rituals of caring for the dead, anointing her with oils and wrapping her in linens. They sent for Peter so that he could properly mourn his friend and fellow disciple who had died. When Peter arrived, Tabitha's friends and disciples offered testimony to her devoted servanthood. They showed Peter tunics and clothing that Tabitha had made for them and testified to the ways she had cared for the widows of Joppa. Her faith was strong, her devotion to Jesus was strong, and her life was centered around being a devoted servant. Her friends, while mourning their loss, were also overjoyed at the lessons she had taught them, and they were ready to exemplify those lessons in the world themselves. But Peter had other plans. He knelt down and he prayed in the presence of the deceased. And then, as a vessel of God's amazing power, Peter cried out, "Tabitha, get up!" She opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she arose. Peter called all of the saints of the church in Joppa to Tabitha's house, and Tabitha became living proof of the awesome power of God. Tabitha did not point to herself. Peter didn't point to himself. They pointed to God. And many believers resulted in that testimony. So why did Peter raise Tabitha from the dead? Certainly her work had already been exemplary. She had already amassed a crowd of loyal supporters, disciples, if you will. She had shown the wisdom of servanthood and lived a life that others were willing to emulate. So why did Peter raise her from the dead? Well, there are a few ways to look at that. One is a bit direct. Peter resurrected Tabitha to perform a miracle to point others to God. By showing this kind of power, Peter is proving God's existence in the world. Peter wanted to point the people of Joppa to God, and what better way to do it than to exemplify God's power in this most incredible way by raising a devoted servant whom everyone loves from the dead. An example of God's power over death. We can look at this as an emulation of Jesus' resurrection. Tabitha was a devoted servant and a humble widow. She emulated the wisdom of Jesus' ministry in the way she lived, so, like Jesus, it would not be inappropriate for her to achieve resurrection as well. Reviving her from the dead, as Peter did, could be seen as an example of Jesus' life. But I think the wisdom of this story goes a bit deeper than that. It encompasses the true story of the entirety of the Bible, the message of hope that the Bible conveys from Genesis 1 through Revelation 22, the story arc that brings life to the lifeless, light to the darkness, and hope to the hopeless. This is the overarching story of the Bible. There are those who mistakenly believe that there is one creation story in the Bible and that it is the literal truth, no matter what science says about the fact of evolution. And then there are those who have actually read the Bible and who understand that there are in fact two creation stories, one in Genesis 1 and one in Genesis 2, that completely contradict each other. Those who realize this begin to understand that the Bible may be deeper than simple, literal reading. But then there are those who understand that the creation story doesn't end with Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, but continues on throughout the Bible. God is constantly creating and recreating while humanity destroys. God creates, God saves, God makes covenant with humanity. Humanity gets selfish and breaks that covenant with God. Humanity cries out to God for deliverance. And then, based in grace, God recreates, God resaves, God makes covenant once more, and so on and so on. The creation stories are not simply relegated to Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. God's creation is told all the way to Revelation 22, God's recreation envisioned through the destruction of the Roman Empire. Well, this story from Acts 9 is another creation story. Through the desperation of the people of Joppa and the destitution of Tabitha's death, God recreates a new beginning imagined through the reanimated life of Tabitha, one of Jesus' most devoted servants. This story of recreation of each one of us is imagined in the life of Tabitha, and the potential for newness is revealed. Tabitha's life and reanimation is an awakening for us all. No matter what type of desperation and destitution you are now going through in your life, God's recreation is always on the horizon. All things are possible for devoted servants of God, through life, through death, and through the next thing that awaits us all. This Memorial Day, as we remember the men and women and others who fought for our freedoms and died for our ability to live as we choose, we also remember the devoted servants of God, Jesus' disciples, who gave their all for the freedom of our faith. As we remember all of these, let their sacrifices not be in vain. We take them into our hearts, we take them into our lives, and may our lives always be a reflection of the lessons they taught us. Amen. Would you